that impact on the White House, with every family coming in, changing a little bit, sometimes the grounds, sometimes the private spaces. The portrait of Lady Bird Johnson, for example, which shows her in this beautiful yellow gown with the Jefferson Memorial over her shoulder, behind her. That's a piece that has been displayed in the Vermeer Room. Can you speak to the way that that space, the Vermeer Room, has changed over the years?
Sure. The May room is just a beautiful room, of course, on the ground floor of the White House. When people come in for tours, they'll see that room. It's one of the first rooms, on the left. You could peek in and see these beautiful portraits, and the portrait, of course, of Mrs. Johnson that hangs on the west wall when she's in a beautiful yellow gown, and she liked the color yellow because it conveyed a sense of optimism. And
Like sunshine for a
like
new day.
sunshine, absolutely. And after, thinking about, of course, when the Johnsons came into the White House, that was after a period of tremendous national grief for the country after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Mrs. Johnson really exuded a warmth, a strength, a resilience, but an incredible sense of compassion as well. And we have her to thank for being one of our nation's first conservationists, First Lady, I think is a fair way to describe her. She really championed the Highway Beautification Act signed by her husband, very, very focused on what our natural landscape is in our country, how beautiful it is, how it should be protected, how different it was from state to state. And she wanted Americans to have pride in the beauty of our nation. And she spent, a considerable amount of time as First Lady. And then also when she left to go back home, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas is really a wonderful museum and place of beauty of our natural abundance of native plants and how they contribute to the beauty of our nation.
Well, today we don't realize what the sides of the road used to look like. That there used to be all of these signs that would be placed and advertisements, and people would throw their Coke bottles out the
That's
window
right.
as they were zipping down the road.
That's right.
And she was very outspoken about, not littering, and
Mhm.
that we should, as you
That's
said,
right.
take pride in these spaces. But then the wildflowers being planted on the sides of the roads. And I used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, and in the springtime, all of these bulbs would come up along the side of the Interstate 40 and the 44. And it was just stunning. And I had no idea.
That really her connection to that, honestly, throughout our nation's highways. And, her experience of being the wife of a congressman, because Lyndon Johnson, of course, was from Congress, from Texas. The Johnsons lived in Northwest Washington in the Spring Valley area for a good portion of that time, and she would drive to Texas, to the home district, and she would see the conditions of our highways and so the littering that you mentioned, and so she felt a real responsibility to do something about it. As most first ladies bring a passion that they have into the White House, into this opportunity that they have with this very powerful platform to make something happen and to get something done. So she has a direct impact on the beauty that you saw along the roads in Missouri as well as people see all over the nation. And the one other point I'll bring about the Vermeer Room that you asked and where her portrait is, years later when Laura Bush was First Lady, she loved Lady Bird Johnson. Of course, the Texas, First Ladies felt a bond with each other, Barbara Bush, Laura Bush, and Lady Bird Johnson. But Laura Bush had the color of the walls in the Vermeer Room really painted to be perfectly complementary to Mrs. Johnson's beautiful portrait that hangs there on the west wall in the Vermeer Room. And Mrs. Bush went through various iterations of paint colors with the residence painter, Cletus Clark, who had been a member of the resident staff, who was the lead painter. And he came up with various different color samples until Mrs. Bush said that's the perfect one. And it really complemented Mrs. Johnson's portrait beautifully. It also complemented Jackie Kennedy's portrait, which of course hangs in the south wall, which is the most visible one to anyone walking by the open door of the Vermeer room. So it's really quite a beautiful room. It is sunny and optimistic in that room, and a perfect setting for Mrs. Johnson's portrait, which Laura Bush got to show to Mrs. Johnson when she
Really?
came. Yes. In the fall of 2005, we had heard from Linda Johnson Robb that she was bringing her mother to Washington, which would for arguably be her last visit, to visit some friends here in Washington that were still, still alive. And so she brought Mrs. John, asked if she could bring her mother to the White House. And of course, Mrs. Bush said yes. She was excited to greet her, and greeted her at the diplomatic reception room doors, and actually had the houseman at the time, who had served as a houseman during the Johnson's administration, Mr. Wilson German, who was still alive and was working part-time at the White House. Mrs. Bush had asked him to greet Mrs. Johnson at the door when she arrived. And Mrs. Johnson, of course, had had a series of strokes, was no longer speaking, but she recognized Mr. German right away, and her eyes lit up, and they fell into each other's arms. And it was really a very moving moment. Again, this connection of these families who live there, and the staff that have worked for them, the resident staff in particular that served so many administrations. But the first thing Laura Bush did was wheel Mrs. Johnson in her wheelchair into the Vermeer room, and brought her in front of her portrait. And she said, "Now, Lady Bird, I have this room repainted to just have your portrait look so beautiful here, where it is. And the color of the walls painted to really complement your beautiful portrait." And it was a very sweet moment.